Are liberal democracies around the world now dying? Two researchers, Yascha Mounk and Roberto Foa, suggest that perhaps, in fact, they are, and they believe that the United States version, perhaps is too. A preview of their findings was published in the New York Times. And Mr. Mounk, who is a Harvard lecturer, joins me now to discuss what they found. And again, some of these numbers that we saw here are staggering, Yascha. But first, with regard to simply the idea of liberal democracy, what is it that you found is happening to it around the world?
For many years, political scientists have simply assumed that liberal democracy in countries like the United States, in Germany, in France, and the sort of blue-chip countries is stable. That once democracy has become what they call the only game in town, once everybody sort of agrees that this is the way we govern ourselves, we really don't have to worry about it anymore. And what we found over the last 15, 20 years is that it no longer looks like democracy is the only game in town in the way it once was. That a lot of citizens of democratic countries are less satisfied with democracy, that they give less importance to living in a democracy, that they're more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, including extreme ones like military rule. And most importantly, there's more and more parties and politicians and movements gaining power, gaining office, gaining influence, who violate democratic norms in very extreme ways.
And this is a part of the democratic deconsolidation, I know, that you found. And here's one of those numbers that really seems striking. Among Americans born in 1980 or later, commonly referred to as millennials, you found that fewer than 1/3 of them say that it is essential for them to live in a democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at people born in the 1930s, 1940s, over 2/3 say, look, it's absolutely crucial to me to live in a democracy. And now among younger people, it's rapidly gone down. And you know, like one way of interpreting this is simply to say that, look, perhaps what's going on here is that they don't have experience with fighting against communism, against fascism, and so they don't say it's important to them. But I think that has real consequences, because we're becoming open to saying, you know what, I see all of these unjust things in our society today, I feel like the system isn't delivering for me, so let's just try something. Let's just see what happens. Let's elect some extreme people and perhaps they'll somehow fix it. And I think that's a very dangerous moment for our liberal democracy.
And certainly, again, could be seen as one way to look at the election just passed here in this country. And you mentioned authoritarian rule. In fact, 1 in 6 Americans, you found, think that military rule would be either a good or a very good thing here in the U.S. if it was believed the government was essentially failing at its job. And again, that's a sentiment particularly strong among young people. How concerning. I mean, 19% of millennials, in fact, agreed that it would be illegitimate for this to happen, which suggests that some 81% might see this to be okay.
Yeah, and the really worrying trend here is over time, that 20 years ago it was only 1 in 16 Americans who believed that, and now it's grown to 1 in 6 over 20 years. When you only look at young and affluent Americans, it used to be, again, 6%, and now it's gone up to 36%, a 6-fold increase over 20 years. So this is very concerning, but you know, it's also important to go beyond the data, right? The data here in a very striking way confirms something that we should know anyway. We see the anger at our political system. We see that people feel that our institutions are doing a terrible job. We see that they're less enthusiastic about engaging in formal politics. And it's this larger picture that really has me worried. You know, political systems in the past have been stable for a long time, and then conditions changed and suddenly they vanished from the earth. Or we're talking about divine right monarchy or certain kind of self-governing republics in the Middle Ages. And we may be seeing something similar playing out here. All through the history of democratic stability, we've seen this very rapid increase in the living standards from one generation to the next. In the United States, for example, it doubled from 1935 to 1960. It doubled again from 1960 to 1985. And now it's been stagnant for 30 years. We simply do not know how our political systems perform under these different circumstances. And that's why we have to be really vigilant and careful about what's happening to our political system.
Well, and now leading our political system, President-elect Donald Trump. And I know that in one interview, you've actually said that Mr. Trump may try to undermine liberal democracy in the United States, may not be, in fact, a symptom of the problem, perhaps, of what you speak of, but may be the problem itself. What did you mean by that?
I think he's both. He's a symptom of the larger disenchantment of democracy, and he may very well undermine our institutions. Look, the Constitution can't defend itself. And political systems only work when all of the people who matter in it have some amount of buy-in, when they care about making it work. Once you have a president-elect who has violated key norms, like not threatening to prosecute his political opponents, not threatening to disregard the outcome of the election if it goes against him, not saying that it's out of the graciousness of his heart, as Kellyanne Conway said, that he's now not trying to put his political opponent in jail. You know, without those things, it's really difficult for a system to work. And we'll see what happens over the next years. I think there's a real risk that Donald Trump will try to undermine the neutrality of key state institutions, whether it's the Department of Justice, whether it's the Internal Revenue Service, whether it's regulators who might harm some of his political opponents like Jeff Bezos, the owner of the Washington Post. I also think there's a real risk that when it comes to a confrontation, when the Supreme Court, for example, strikes down a key part of Trump's agenda, he will simply disregard it or try to pack the court or give a press conference and say, you know what, I'm going to do it anyway. And if that happens, it's incumbent on all of us who care about the Constitution, who care about liberal democracy, including people in his own party, to draw a clear line and stand up against that. Because it's only if we can get that consensus back, if we can make democracy the only game in town again, that our system will be safe in the long run.
Now, at least one political scientist, Yascha, has argued that your data perhaps is not worrying as it is believed to be. Ronald Engelhardt spoke to the fact that perhaps this is just specifically an American issue, that dysfunction in our government is really what it is you are speaking of. To that rebuttal, you say what?
So I think Ronald Engelhardt is also quite worried about what's going on. He does have a very helpful critique of our first paper that shows that it's mostly based on the United States at that moment. That's why in the forthcoming paper, which was the subject of this New York Times article, we present quite a lot of evidence that the same thing is going on across the universe of established democracies. So whenever you look at those countries that were supposed to be most safe, most stable, you see this growing disenchantment of democracy. That's true not only in the United States, but in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, in New Zealand, in a whole bunch of countries around the world.
It is a fascinating study, Yascha Mounk, and we do thank you and Mr. Foa for it, and we thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much.